Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. How should we review recent developments on the line of actual control in Ladakh? Are we seeing significant disengagement? Will this lead to meaningful de-escalation? And beyond all of that, are we in a crisis with China today because India has misunderstood, possibly misread China and Chinese messages? Those are the key issues I should raise today with the former Additional Secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat and the present President of the Center for China Analysis and Strategy, Jayadeva Ranade. Mr. Ranade, let's start with the recent reported disengagement in Galwan and Hot Springs and hopefully later today in Gogra. If all that we read in newspapers is accurate and true, is this a meaningful, significant first step to resolve the problem on the LAC in Ladakh?
I wouldn't use the term resolve, Karan. I would say that this is a significant first step in order to defer imminent hostilities. That is how I would look at it, because I think the manner in which the Chinese forces were deployed, the numbers in which they came, certainly signaled an objective. And this disengagement, if it happens, it is certainly going to take a long time, but if it happens, it indicates that that threat has been deferred or at least pushed back a bit.
Let's look at some of the implications of the disengagement that is happening. One of the measures that India has agreed to is the creation of a buffer zone to separate Indian soldiers from Chinese soldiers. And it's reported that these buffer zones will be roughly 4 kilometers wide. In Galwan, to talk specifically about Galwan, the business standard says that the buffer zone will lie entirely in Indian territory. How do you view the possibility of a buffer zone that is entirely in Indian territory? Isn't that something that is a setback for India and a gain for China?
I think what we are talking about is a line of actual control. It's not a border. And therefore, when we look at this buffer zone that is being created, actually the entire Galwan Valley lies within Indian territory. However, this buffer zone is probably being created just to avoid physical contact between the soldiers, particularly now that we have revised our rules for troops on patrol and allowing them to carry and fire weapons depending on the situation as the commander sees it. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that, but the bigger question is whether that will hold, one, and secondly, that the Chinese have now reiterated their claim on the entire Galwan Valley.
You know, as you began by saying, the entire Galwan area or valley is Indian. However, Ajay Shukla, who is usually extremely well informed, writing in the Business Standard this morning, Thursday, has said that in fact the new marker for the border, or the LAC rather, at Galwan used to be PP14. It's now something called Wainala, which is 1 kilometer into Indian territory. So the first point he makes is that as a result, the LAC has moved 1 kilometer into Indian territory. Is that of concern?
Well, I'm not familiar with the exact details. I have not studied the satellite maps, but I'm sure many people are watching the situation. Many people abroad too are studying what is happening on the border through high-resolution satellite photographs, and I cannot comment on the 1 kilometer back or forth, but Ajay Shukla has made a comment. I've heard from somewhere else also that there is a 1.5 kilometer move back by both forces, which would mean that we would have pulled back into our own territory as far as the LAC, if we use the LAC as a marker. That's about all I could say right now on this.
Now, in fact, that point that you make about a 1.5 kilometer pullback is another one that was made by Ajay Shukla in the Business Standard today. He says, first of all, the marker for the LAC has moved from PP14 to Wainala, which means it's come 1 kilometer into what India believes is Indian territory. Secondly, the first border post the countries have agreed will be a further 1.5 kilometers inland from Wainala, which means that India is now roughly 2.4 kilometers away from what it claims to be the final point of its LAC claim. And that is a 2.4 kilometer area we cannot patrol. China, on the other hand, is simply 400 meters away from their final point of claim. So the disproportion is huge. India set back by 2.4 kilometers, China by just 400 meters.
It sounds, as you said, disadvantageous to us. But I look at the fact that this was actually discussed between our corps commander, Lieutenant General Harinder Singh, and the Chinese counterpart, Yulin, and they agreed on it. So I presume General Harinder Singh would have looked at the topographical advantages to the military by citing the border post where they have finally agreed, and by in the terms of the, shall I say, pullback or the buffer zone, they would have looked at all that, and I presume that he would not have selected anything disadvantageous. So we'll have to look at that factor also.
Now, one of the other points about the buffer zone, as reported by the papers, is that for at least 30 days there will be no military patrolling in the buffer zone. Is there a danger that these buffer zones could become permanent, thus denying India the right to patrol to the full extent of its claim?
It could happen. A lot depends on how our army and how our political leadership approaches the situation. But if it is only for the purposes of avoiding physical contact or physical clashes, it means that the other side would also have to follow the same regimen. So a lot depends on that, how we move forward. Secondly, I would say that there is a verification process also brought in, which is a 72-hour process, which will protract the time taken for this disengagement. So let us see what happens before we start accepting this position.
You make a very good point that if this does become permanent, it would be an equal disadvantage to both sides. But then if you bear in mind the point that Ajay Shukla made, that the disadvantage in Galwan to India is that India is distanced 2.4 kilometers from its final claim. China, he says, is only distanced 400 meters. So although both will suffer to some extent if this does become a permanent arrangement, India suffers considerably more than China, if Ajay Shukla is correct.
Yeah, in terms of physical distance. But as I pointed out, another factor which is also important is whether it's a militarily advantageous position to us or not. And I'm sure that with our general there, and he's an educated general, he's a thinking general, he's worked in a think tank and all that, he'd have factored all that in. So the other report that I read, I don't know whether it's correct or not, is that Galwan Valley per se will be off limits to troops of both sides. So I don't know what is the real situation.
But as you said, even if there is a greater disadvantage to India, it could well be balanced by the fact that General Harinder Singh may have chosen a location which has topographical advantage, which would perhaps counter the distance, the disproportionate distance that India is further from the LAC compared to China. That's a good point. We just don't know if that is the case. It may well be, however. Now, let's come to Pangong Lake. As yet, there is no meaningful disengagement there at all, but there are reports that China has built very substantial defensive structures. At the moment, India is restricted and cannot patrol beyond Finger 4, which means that roughly some 50 square kilometers where earlier we had access, we no longer do. Everyone believes that in fact disengagement at Pangong Lake will be the most difficult. How worried are you about that? Do you think it will prove a stumbling block, or do you think eventually it can be agreed to?
I think it will be quite a protracted negotiation before the Chinese push back, and a lot will depend on what resolve we show to them on Pangong. Because it was in April, or since April, that at least I noticed some Tibet civilian authorities coming down there and talking about long-term plans for the development of the Pangong Lake, which they described as an international lake, and things like this. So obviously the Chinese had some long-term plans for it. They probably didn't expect the kind of obstruction that we have raised. And now there will be lengthy negotiations on this.
In fact, a couple of newspapers, both the Business Standard and one or two more, have reported today that the Chinese are saying that they will only consider withdrawing from finger 4, possibly to finger 6, if India withdraws to finger 2. In other words, they will still be in what we claim our territory, because our territory goes to finger 8, but we have been pushed even further back. So that proposal from the Chinese as a condition to disengage at Bangkok surely has to be unacceptable from the very word go.
I think that's a maximalist negotiating position that the Chinese have put forward, and I expect we will not accept it straight away. So there will be protracted negotiations, as I said, on this entire issue. Let us see where they lead.
Now, this disengagement that we're talking about is happening just a few days after our National Security Advisor Ajit Doval spoke to the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. The problem is that the statements the two countries put out were different in many critical respects. First of all, the Chinese statement spoke, and I'm quoting, of the right and wrong of what recently happened at the Galwan Valley, and then it added, China will continue firmly safeguarding our territorial sovereignty. That's clearly a reiteration of China's claim to all of Galwan, and that is something that has to be unacceptable to India.
Well, the sentence prior to the one you just read out also stressed that that entire area was Chinese, under Chinese sovereignty. So they were specific about their claim. It's a disturbing paragraph that they have put into their statement. That was like a preamble, in fact, before they went into the subsequent points. And I think it is disturbing. It does indicate that the Chinese have not given up their claims, and that this portion of the border will be unsettled and it will be problematic.
So this is a problem that is by no means resolved simply by disengaging. We here have a key core issue that China claims all of Galwan, we believe it's always been ours, and so there's a huge dispute that needs to be tackled before we can say this issue is resolved.
Quite right, which is why I, if I could use the term deferred with your description of the term resolved at the beginning, because I do notice that this is going to be an issue. The second, if I may add, is China's claim to the whole of Ladakh. And they made that first in April 2013, and it was repeated, in fact, in the Global Times during this crisis. I think it was around May 17 or May 18.
The second dissonance emerges this time when you look at the Indian statement and how it differs from the Chinese. The Indian statement talks about, and I'm again quoting, the need to strictly respect and observe the LAC and not take any unilateral action to alter the status quo. Now, the Chinese statement has no reference to the LAC whatsoever, and it certainly doesn't talk about respecting the LAC. So once again, that is a disturbing difference in the position taken by the two countries.
It indicates, Karan, to my mind, that neither side has accepted the other's position on this issue. And it indicates also that there is a difference which over time they hope to resolve peacefully.
In which case, if neither side has accepted the other's position, and that is a very logical conclusion from the dissonances we're discussing, then if you add to that the fact that China is continually reiterating its claim to all of Galwan, and it refuses to say that it respects the LAC, then in that light, doesn't the disengagement that's happened A, seem temporary, and B, possibly reversible?
I think what we are seeing, Karan, is the deferment of an imminent threat which was probably being planned by the Chinese, but it does not mean a resolution of all these issues. So the disengagement is a tactical move, to my mind, for the present.
Are we witnessing what has been commented upon by many China analysts, the well-established Chinese strategy of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, which leaves the Chinese with a 1-step gate? Are you seeing that here as well?
That may be the Chinese hope, But I don't think we are going to be in a mood to accept that. In fact, as the days go by, I think we are also getting in more military hardware and we are deploying them, which will strengthen our position too. So I think, as I said, this is not the end of it. I don't expect, but I don't suppose we will give them the extra inch or the extra yard that they're asking for. But how it pans out, we'll have to wait and see. There are many imponderables in this which we'll have to watch out for, including domestic developments inside China.
Now, the disengagement we're talking about is, of course, only the first step. The Indian side is hoping that after this disengagement, there will be a substantial de escalation when the soldiers massed by both countries on the LAC go back to their positions as they were in April. According to the Times of India yesterday, India is supposed to have 30,000 troops at the LAC. According to today's Indian Express, the Chinese are supposed to have 40,000. How easy will de escalation be? And do you believe it's a process that's going to take months to happen? Certainly not days and probably not weeks, months.
Yes, I would expect it will take a long time. I mean, I can't say how many weeks or how many months, but it will take a long time. There are no indicators yet and no reports yet of a de-escalation taking place or, shall I say, a pulling back of the reserves and the forces by either side. So both are deployed there, and I think that is why there is a impermanency, or shall I say, there is a fluidity to the entire arrangement.
Mr. Ranade, what happens if the status quo ante is not restored before winter sets in? How long and how easily can India maintain up to 30,000 troops at the LAC when temperatures have started to plummet below minus 10, in some areas minus 20? How easy will this be?
I think times are different than earlier days. I was in Leh in the 70s, so I'm aware of how uncomfortable, if I may say, it gets. But let me say that I think our troops will be in position. We have now very modern hospitals. We have better facilities for the troops there. They will be able to stay on. As far as the Chinese side is concerned, there is this thinking that perhaps with the winter coming in, they will withdraw. Well, I have my doubts about that because their logistics are very well developed. So is their accommodation for troops and their communication. So I think both sides, if push comes to shove, can stay on at the border, and if and probably will if they see no one pulling back.
There are some reports that suggest that in fact the Chinese have built particularly effective solid brick or mortar barracks where soldiers can be easily housed with heating, with running tap water. Are their facilities, particularly their infrastructure facilities, considerably superior to us? I'm talking about in terms of housing large numbers of soldiers.
I don't know about superior, but I certainly know that they have built these infrastructures over the years. They have got communications over the years between each border post. They have built accommodation to house additional troops who are brought in cases of emergency. And my understanding is that they had also built, places for ammunition dumps and food supplies to be stored. So they have equipped themselves well. They've got, as I said, communications. They've got metal road. They've got fiber optics between each border post. So, and I presume that in today's date, we would have done quite a lot of this ourselves.
One last question before I take a break. You repeatedly said that what the disengagement at best had done was to defer the imminent threat of hostilities. I take it that means that it only deferred, that threat still remains. This situation could turn to hostility and combat if not skillfully handled at very short notice.
Yes, unfortunately, that's correct in my estimation. A lot depends on how it is handled. A lot depends on how the leaderships of both sides view the situation and whether they want conflict or not. I think on the Indian side, it's been made very clear that we are looking for peace and development rather than conflict. And to that extent, I think Prime Minister Modi's visit to Ladakh was quite a clear message.
One more question. If it were to come to conflict, what is your assessment of the Indian Army's capacity to stand up to the Chinese? Their economy is 5 times bigger than ours. The funding of their army has been considerably greater, sometimes 3 times more than ours for several years. So what is the capacity of our army to stand up to theirs?
I think that question is better answered by a person who does military analysis. But let me tell you what I would estimate, I think fairly reasonably. The first is the Chinese calculation is for a short, swift, localized battle where they bring overwhelming firepower and claim a victory. Uh, I don't think they're going to get that. I don't think it's going to be short or swift or that a victor will emerge. There'll be damage on both sides. It'll be bloody and it'll be protracted, which is not what the Chinese leadership wants. They want a clear-cut victory which they're able to project to their people. Secondly, their army has not fought since 1979. For their troops to stay in Tibet and complete their tenure, and I'm saying complete their tenure, not stay on for an additional period, they are paid higher allowances. Almost every year, we've been noticing their allowances are raised. So obviously, they have a problem. Thirdly, the troops are a mix. Many of them are people who are studying in universities or who are eager to get back to universities to complete their studies with state funding. And whether they make hardened and battle-worthy soldiers is a question mark. I think it's debatable, along with the fact that a number of them would be one child, from one child families. So we've been seeing posts on WIPO asking the soldiers where they are, when are they coming home, etc., from concerned parents. This is normal, but in China that could be slightly magnified. So on balance, I would say that it's not going to be an easy situation for the Chinese. It will be a pretty tough fight. And as I said, there'll be no victors. There'll be damage on both sides.
I'm particularly interested in the way you ended that answer, Mr. Ranade. You said no winner, no loser. Would that in fact amount to a setback for the Chinese and for Xi Jinping in particular?
Certainly, Karan, absolutely. Because what the Chinese are, Xi Jinping, since he has come in, has pumped the Chinese people with a lot of nationalism in addition to party ideology. And he has taken the credit and positioned himself as the person who's modernizing the PLA, who's giving it a lot of latest equipment and who's getting it battle ready. Virtually all his speeches, he talks about prepare for battle and prepare the PLA to fight and win. So that is what he's looking at. Now, if there is going to be a fight with us, if it's going to be bloody and protracted and no victory, then it's going to dent his image even further, domestically, I mean. So it will be a setback for him. China will view it as a defeat.
That's very clear. Let's take a break at that point. When I come back in part two, I want to ask, have we got ourselves into this crisis because India did not correctly read or perhaps misunderstood the Chinese? We'll be back in a moment's time, but first, a little break. Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is the former Additional Secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat and the present President of the Center for China Analysis and Strategy, Jayadeva Ranade. Mr. Ranade, I want to start by exploring with you the question, have we got into this crisis because we misread or misunderstood China? Yesterday, the Business Standard in its editorial suggested, and I'm quoting, New Delhi wrongly assumed the country faced no serious threats to its territorial integrity because of its reliance on personalized diplomacy. Did we get taken away by talk of the Wuhan spirit and the success of Mamalapuram by our own belief that there was a special relationship between President Xi and Prime Minister Modi? Did all of that carry us away and take our focus in the wrong direction?
My understanding is that China's negative attitude towards India, China's sort of, shall I say, the tensions in the India-China relationship have been building for some time now, couple of years. And again, my understanding is that in the concerned quarters in our government, they were quite clear that the relationship is not as it should be. The summit meetings between Modi and Xi Jinping could have been designed to try and keep the temperatures, within a certain range. But the fact that the relationship was under strain, I think, was clear to our people. Whether they factored the military adventurism of China or not, I am not aware. But my own understanding is that they were aware that the relationship itself is not in a good shape.
When you say that they may not have factored the military adventurism of China, that suggests that, in fact, a very important aspect of the potential problem that was looming wasn't taken into consideration.
Let me clarify. They, in fact, when I talked about military adventurism, they may have looked at intrusions taking place along the border. The number of intrusions in any case have increased, but I don't think they anticipated the kind of massive pressure along 1100 kilometers of the LAC being applied on us by the Chinese, as we have today. I look at it as an arc of pressure that has been built up, and now, according to reports, stretching up to Arunachal. So I don't think they anticipated this massive build-up and concentration of forces at multiple points. This is my personal view. I don't know what's the thinking in the higher reaches, of course.
Not anticipating this massive build-up of Chinese forces or Chinese pressure along 1100 kilometers of the LAC, is that a lapse?
Well, I suppose one can't prepare for everything, but there should have been anticipation here.
Now, former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran goes one step further. He says that China doesn't see India as an equal. It doesn't even believe India is a significant factor in its Asian or in its global strategy. To quote him, he says, after 2015, China began to benchmark itself against the United States and relegated relations with other emerging countries to the second rung. China regards its relations with India as no longer a significant factor in its Asian and global strategy. To put it bluntly, the Asian space, it believes, has room only for an ascendant China, not India. Would you agree with that as well?
Well, not entirely. Let me say that I agree with the last comment that China views Asia as its domain and where it will reign supreme. Now, obviously, that leads to a clash of interests between China and India. But the other parts, I think China began preparing itself vis-a-vis the United States from around 2007, 2008, when the global economic downturn happened, and not in 2015. Secondly, from 2015, when Xi Jinping unveiled the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, it is since that time that they have been looking at India as a possible adversary. The fact that we opposed the Belt and Road Initiative, a number of Chinese academics pointed to that as a major obstacle in the development of the Belt and Road Initiative. Thirdly, since Doklam, the Chinese have been looking at India in military terms. The number of exercises held on the Tibetan high altitude plateau have increased. The exercises included different kinds of troops being involved, artillery, infantry, the special forces, etc. It involved aircraft activities, including aircraft from different theatre commands being brought in. So they were preparing. They were also references to India while they were doing all this. Sometimes clear references, sometimes to an adversary, and the adversary was obvious. So I think the indicators were quite clear that they were looking at India as now a potential military threat, which was magnified in their mind after the surgical strikes in Balakot, because they looked at their assets in those areas. So I don't think that they look at India as insignificant and not something to be taken care of. I think it is something in their calculation which needs to be sorted out to convey a message to everyone else also.
You said, and I'm quoting you, since Doklam, China has been looking at India in military terms, and then you sketched out in considerable detail the sort of military exercises they've been carrying out in the Tibetan Plateau, the sort of equipment and planes that they have positioned there. In the light of what you said, it seems very strange that our authorities or our concerned ministers did not really factor in the possibility of Chinese military adventurism. It seems so strange that this should have been happening, and yet that possibility along an 1100-kilometer stretch of the LAC wasn't really factored in. It really does suggest, as I asked you earlier, was this a lapse?
Well, as I said, they may have looked at military adventurism from a different perspective. I don't know. But this massive build-up, something I think which compares to 1962 actually, they probably didn't anticipate it, but they should have. As I said, the signals were there.
That's a good point you're making. They should have if they didn't. Let's pull out and try and look at the bigger picture. Many people get the feeling that whether you look at what China is doing presently in Ladakh right across the LAC, or the way China has opposed India's membership of the NSG and the United Nations Security Council, or the way China at the moment is needling Nepal to take up anti-India positions and its involvement in particular with Prime Minister Modi, or the bigger relationship that it's forging with neighbors like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Burma, Sri Lanka, all of whom, in a sense, are being lured away from their earlier closer relationship with India. Do you get the feeling that China's real aim is A, to check India and restrict it, and secondly, to deny India the fulfillment of this Indian ambition to sit at the high table?
Certainly, certainly. It is to keep us boxed in South Asia, to prevent our rise if possible, and of course deny us place at the high table, because as I said, China believes that on a mountaintop there can be only one tiger. That's an old saying of theirs. So, and they consider that they're the tiger. One other factor I think I should have mentioned earlier in the factors for a strain in the relationship is the fact that China perceived that we were now rising, that Prime Minister Modi particularly had started building an international stature which discomfited them. So that was another factor that came in. But what you said just now, what you sketched out, is absolutely correct. They certainly don't want us rising. They don't want another challenge, particularly a country which also has ancient civilizational claims which probably exceed those of China.
So then, does it follow that whilst India and China have to have peaceful relations, they are very unlikely to be friends, and that the attempt that Mr. Modi made to befriend China may have been a noble attempt, but it was mistaken. It could not succeed for the simple reason China will not see us as an equal, or as you put it, on the mountaintop there can only be one tiger, and China is already that tiger.
Yes, quite right. I think Mr. Modi tried what others have also tried, to reach out to the Chinese, to look at other opportunities, whether economic or otherwise. But here I must say that when he traveled to China in 2015, he gave a speech gave a talk at Tsinghua University, one of their prestigious universities, where he made it very clear that the Chinese leadership have to change the way they think if they want the relationship between the two countries to attain its full potential. So he was aware that he was in dipping into troubled waters, if I may say, and trying to see whether this peaceful development and economic cooperation was possible. But it has been proved otherwise. And I think one of the factors responsible is the advent of Xi Jinping, who has his own agenda.
If I'm not mistaken, it was during that same trip to China in 2015, and very possibly at that same university, although I'm not sure of the latter, that Mr. Modi also spoke in glowing terms of his special relationship with President Xi, about how President Xi had told him that Hwan Sang, after coming from Gujarat, Mr. Modi's hometown, had gone to Mr. Xi's hometown. And he then spoke about the special bond they'd established. That perhaps is the point at which many people thought there was a real friendship and there would be no Chinese military adventurism. Surely that belief in a bond was mistaken on our part.
I think that comment was made before Modi went to Tsinghua University. But yes, it was made. If people, shall I say, fell for it, it's surprising because the Chinese say nice things when they're receiving guests, much as we do. But we should not believe the hype that we build up.
You're suggesting, although you haven't said it, that we fell for our own hype. We created the hype and believed it ourselves as well.
Well, I hope that in the quarters that matter, they didn't fall for it. The others might have.
Finally, we're getting to the end of this interview. Are there pressure points that India can use to put pressure on China?
There are, Karan, there are a number of pressure points, and these are things I'm sure are being looked at. The first hint that we saw was on the economic front. It should have happened long time ago, but was the ban on TikTok, which I understand from the Chinese business papers is the potential to cost them about $6 billion. But there are many other sectors which we need to move in. The economic sector and the technology sectors have to be looked at. The education sector is another, where they are trying to come in here and set up little institutes, which in fact give their version of history, which is something that impacts young minds particularly. So these are areas that we need to restrict them, their entry. The economy particularly, and I think one good signal and a major signal that we can give in the current context is to deny Huawei entry into 5G.
My last question. Everyone says that this is a turning point. The relationship between India and China will never be the same. Do you have any sense in what ways that relationship must change?
I think firstly we need to, well, firstly let me say that I hope and I think that the scales have dropped off the eyes of many people as to what China really is. I think in going ahead, I would probably see more circumspect approach to China. It would be marked by absent trust rather than talk of trust deficit. I hope we will not have a rush to sign numerous agreements whenever there are summit level meetings. We should be realistic as to what we are looking at, and we should always keep a sharp eye out for what China's ambitions are, because they have brought or incorporated their two centenaries goals, which is to the China Dream by the 100th year of the Chinese Communist Party's founding, which is next year, 2021, which includes the recovery of all the territories that they've lost, which brings us to Arunachal Pradesh, Ladakh, Sikkim, etc. And by 2049 to rival, if not overtake, the United States. These two agendas which they have by 2049, which is the year of the founding of the People's Republic of China, have now been brought into their constitution. So it's a national objective. And I think till they modulate that, we all have to be very alert.
In other words, to put it in a nutshell, rather than reach out a hand and embrace the Chinese, we need to be very careful, skeptical, and often doubtful of what they're actually up to. What they say or the face they present is not necessarily what they intend or what they mean.
Quite correct. Quite correct. I couldn't have put it better.
Mr. Ranade, thank you very much for this interview. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you, Karan, and same to you. It's been a pleasure being on your show.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.